Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's 12 o'clock sharp, so I think we'll get started for today's She Talk. And once again, thank you all for joining us. Today's topic is democracy and sustainability. And we have an hour together, which I think will be really, really exciting. My name is Tony Sandset, and I'm a researcher at the Center for Sustainable Healthcare Education here at the Faculty of Medicine at University of Oslo. And today I have one keynote speaker who will hold a brief lecture and another co-discussant with me today, which I will go ahead and quickly introduce. And my co-discussants for today is who will be part of asking our esteemed key lecture questions later on is Siri Hundstad Quamme, who is a 24-year-old student from Mandal here in Norway, who is currently studying clinical nutrition and started doing so in 2018. And she's at her third year as a student studying clinical nutrition, and is also the student leader for the involvement of SHE here at the Center for Sustainable Healthcare Education. And I'm really happy that Siri is joining us today to be part of this lecture on democracy and sustainability, which will be spearheaded by a brief lecture, 30-minute lecture by Professor Dan Banik, who is a professor of political science here at the faculty here at the University of Oslo. And he's the director of the Oslo SDG initiatives at the Center for Development and the Environment here at University of Oslo. He's also, of course, an affiliate professor at the Center for Sustainable Healthcare Education at the Faculty of Medicine. And he's also, I have to mention this, the host of a really, really interesting podcast that you should all jump into, which is called In Pursuit of Development, a wonderful name and also a really, really great podcast. He's also a columnist for The Nation and has published a broad range of articles and books on the topic, which we will be talking about today, sustainability and democracy. And before I give the word to Dan, I just want to briefly sketch out today's program, which will be a 30-minute lecture, give or take, where Dan will approach the topic of democracy and sustainability. And then we'll have a 20-minute, not necessarily a Q&A, but a discussion between Dan, Siri, and myself, where we'll talk about his points that he's been talking about in the lecture, as well as some other concerns that touches upon democracy and sustainability. And then we'll have 10 minutes at the end where you, the audience, can ask questions. And I really, really implore you to write your questions in the chat. I'll remind you of that after Dan's lecture, but I hope you will enjoy the lecture and enjoy the talk. And then please do not hesitate to write your questions in the chat or raise your hand for that matter. And I guess without further ado, I'll give the word to you, Dan. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Tony. Welcome, everyone. It's a beautiful day in Oslo. The sun is out, and I'm really delighted to be able to give this talk. I've been looking forward to it for a while. I'm coming to you from my attic. I've been upgraded from the basement because my wife felt I should have a proper internet connection, a wired connection, all the joys of pandemic life. And I'd rather have actually given this lecture in person. We are all assembled in a room, but that is not possible. I'm trying to be optimistic in this year and a half that we've been living through this crisis. And I'm trying to look at both sides now. So on the positive side of things, I'm told a lot of people are joining us from other parts of the world that would not have been possible had we met in person. That's one thing. And also, secondly, it is somehow this pandemic has forced us to think differently. It may have even democratized the kind of knowledge that we produce. So thanks to Tony for that great introduction and for selling the idea of listening to my podcast. And this last year or so, I've been interacting with colleagues all over the world on some of these issues, in addition to conducting research, as Tony mentioned, as part of the Oslo SDG initiative. And so today's talk is really based on some of these recent interactions. And by the way, I've been reading far more books this past year than I've ever done in my life before. So there are some really good advantages of not traveling. So I'm thinking of structuring this talk according to the following three sort of general themes. One has to do with certain concepts related to democracy and sustainable development. And then in the second part, I want to introduce to you some case studies, some stories, some examples from some of the countries that I conduct research in, and also my team. And towards the end, the third part, I want to reflect on the role of democracy and try to build some of these arguments that I'm going to make and discuss these in relation to the examples. And hopefully there will be certain topics that we could conduct further discussions on with Tony and Siri. So let's get cracking. The first set of issues really has to do with the concept of democracy and sustainable development. Let's begin with democracy. You know, a lot of you, of course, are aware of what democracy means. There are various ways of understanding democracy. A lot of my colleagues, people who do a lot of work on democracy, like my Stanford colleague, Larry Diamond, would talk about the distinction between, say, minimalist forms of democracy versus more substantial or substantive forms of democracy. So minimalist forms of democracy, as in elections, holding regular, free and fair elections, and being able to change governments and making people actually leave office. So one popular way of understanding democracy in a minimalist form is that it's a way of getting rid of governments, that democracy is the ability to lose elections, and whoever has lost, the incumbent has lost, is willing to leave office without too much protest and just on a voluntary way. But others would say that kind of minimalist conception of democracy perhaps is inadequate to tackle some of the challenges that people in many parts of the world face. So, for example, if you were to address poverty reduction or to address some of the challenges posed by climate change, you would need far more sort of, you need a stronger state, you need different versions of democracy, you need much more proactive state action that goes way beyond just the kind of focus on elections. And some of the recent evidence, and I want to refer to two recent reports that have come out. The most important one actually is the Varieties of Democracy project at the University of Gothenburg, called the VDEM report, which actually paints a pretty gloomy picture. It shows that we're actually living under very, very difficult times, not that we weren't aware of it, but a large majority of the world's population actually lives under autocracies now. The situation today is actually what the situation was in 1990, before this kind of euphoria with the growing amount of countries that were becoming democratic. Now we have what a lot of people have termed a democratic recession. There is democracy is backsliding. And these are findings that are echoed not just in the VDEM report, but also in reports by influential think tanks like Freedom House, where certain countries that seemed to be the beacons of democracy, a country I know pretty well, India, has been classified as being an electoral autocracy. Now, the debate, of course, is ongoing, and a lot of people don't agree with this classification, but nonetheless, the general trend in some of these reports is that democracy is backsliding and is of enormous concern to us. We'll return to some of these issues slightly later. The second concept has to do with sustainable development. And of course, as you're aware, we in Norway have a particular affinity towards this concept because our former Prime Minister, Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, chaired this commission, popularly known as the Brundtland Commission, that issued this very influential 1987 report called Our Common Future. And in that report, what was particularly interesting has been the enduring definition of sustainable development that has endured almost 30 years, which is basically that we really have to think about, addressing the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And that definition itself is pretty crucial. And just bear that in mind when I return to some of the problematic aspects or some of the challenges that democracies face in relation to these generational issues. But I was actually recently speaking with Gro Harlem Brundtland. I've had the pleasure of interacting with her extensively over the years. On my podcast a couple of months ago, she told me that it's taken 30 years for that concept of sustainable development to become mainstream, and which isn't actually that bad. 30 years for an idea as radical or perhaps as controversial as sustainable development, it's pretty good. But the fact of the matter is that the concept has, or the popularity of the concept has ebbed and flowed for a while. A lot of my colleagues in the US particularly would often characterize sustainable development as being very wishy-washy. It is a bit of everything and a bit of nothing. Again, scholars like Frank Bierman, a colleague at Utrecht University that I've been speaking with of late, he says also, sustainable development is such an all-encompassing topic that it's very difficult to be against it. So in a way, it is difficult to sometimes prioritize. But what has changed in the past few years since 2015 is, and something that we've been working at this center called SHE, is this rejuvenation of the concept because of the 2030 Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which encompass both development, environment, consumer behavior, infrastructure, and also climate change. So you have the whole gamut of international goals that we're supposed to achieve in less than 9 years from now. Unfortunately, the world was off track before the pandemic struck, and now, of course, the pandemic has made things worse. So what is my argument then? Well, my argument is as follows. I think development, and I know that development is not a concept where there is always an agreement on the way forward. Development is by definition a very contested concept. There are different ideas of development. Development is often very contextual. Development means different things to different people in our societies as well as in societies in many other parts of the world. So there really isn't one magic bullet or one way in which we can achieve development or sustainable development. But the impression that has been created in recent years is that we have found the magic bullet. And if only we pursue the 2030 Agenda, if only we somehow agreed, which we have, 193 countries have, towards this in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, if only we just blindly follow whatever has been agreed, we will get there. And I'm going to argue that that is not the case. In fact, what we really need, and this is where democracy comes in, is that we really need deliberation. We really mustn't just become complacent in thinking we know the answers. In fact, we really need to continuously deliberate. We need to continuously challenge and push the frontiers and really question critically, but also in a balanced way and in an independent way, look at the facts, look at the evidence, and think about the way forward. So even though I'm a political scientist, and it's not because I'm a political scientist that I'm making this claim, I think it is the politics of sustainable development that has in many ways been sidelined. It hasn't been given the kind of prominence because there has been this tendency among many actors. Now that we have the 2030 Agenda, now that we know what the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals are, let's just get cracking, let's just get to work. But it turns out we don't agree. It turns out when you do work in many parts of the world, they say sustainable development means different things to you in Norway than it does to us in India or China or Malawi or Kenya. So it's the politics of sustainable development that I'm going to talk about. So that's the first part. Let me illustrate the second part with some examples from some of the countries that I've been studying. Let's begin with Kenya in East Africa. Now, some of the examples, and because of the lack of time, I'm just going to focus on some examples related to energy and infrastructure mainly. Many of you know that infrastructure, the lack of it, is a big problem on the African continent, and just the sheer number of roads and bridges and buildings that need to be constructed is important. China is playing a very important role through its Belt and Road Initiative, but there's also a very polarized discourse on the role of China and the Belt and Road Initiative and its impact. So in Kenya, for example, in the last a few years, two projects have received considerable attention within the country, but also outside. One has to do with Kenya's historically the most expensive infrastructure project that it has built is a railway project funded and constructed by the Chinese that links Nairobi, the capital of Nairobi, to the port city of Mombasa. And now this project is being expanded. I had the pleasure actually of riding on that impressive train, and it was just a very smooth, it's a high-speed train. It has shortened the distance. It has made travel safer. There were lots of accidents when people were driving on a treacherous stretch of road between Nairobi and Mombasa. Comfortable, air-conditioned journey. So all of this, and it's relatively cheap. So I was pretty impressed. But when I started looking into the debates, it turns out that this project was very controversial. One had to do with the environmental impacts. So the impacts on wildlife parks, because the train, the construction process actually went through a lot of this territory. And so it was almost like, well, it wasn't almost, it was that human lives, human activity was prioritized at the cost of wildlife. So that was one set of issues. The second actually had to do with things like, can the country afford this project? And thirdly, and it turns out that Kenya is struggling to make its repayment. But thirdly, there were also concerns about, do we really need this? And, there were some perhaps allegations of corruption involved in all of this, but it was this secrecy. And in recent years, the media has been extremely active in trying to push this debate, trying to get further information, and the Kenyan government hasn't always been forthcoming. A slightly different example in the same country has to do with a coal-fired power plant. Now, not just infrastructure, but also energy, or the lack of it, is a big problem on the African continent. And Kenya, like many other countries on the continent, is struggling to generate enough electricity and connect people on its, to the grid. Now, again, with Chinese-backed financing and technology, the decision was made, in addition to some solar power plants, etc., they were going to build a coal-fired power plant on the archipelago of Lamu. Now, this was, of course, something that a lot of local people thought was not a very good idea. So what was particularly impressive, and I'm trying to cut the story short, is there was this huge popular protest movement that was mobilized. You had local activists, you had climate and environmental activists, together with academics, together with lawyers filing suits in the courts. And what they were able to do through this impressive political mobilization was to highlight the dangers of this dirty fossil fuel that is coal, saying that the Kenyan government should pursue much more cleaner strategies. This was not the way forward. And the Environmental Tribunal in Kenya actually put a stop to that. So the current status of the project is that it is not being constructed. And we don't know whether this will change in the future, but it has been halted. So that was a very good example of democratic rights, actually a democracy aiding the environment, aiding the needs and interests, articulating the interests of locals who felt that this was not a good idea. Similar things are happening in a country that I've been studying also, Malawi, where only 10% of its, say, 18.6 million people are connected to the grid. And, Malawi's energy generation is very, very insignificant. So it is basically hydroelectric power that is generated on one river called the Shire. But because of climate change, because of receding water levels, because of the onset of droughts, they're not being able to produce as much electricity as they had hoped. And I was there last year, actually. This was the only trip I made before the pandemic struck and all borders were closed down in Malawi. I was talking to engineers, and it turns out that they are actually, many of them prefer a coal-fired power plant rather than a new hydroelectric power project that would be much more clean. It turns out the reasons are somewhat interesting. It's because coal is cheap. That is what they felt their country can afford. Building a coal-fired power plant is also quicker, much more quicker than a hydroelectric power plant, which is also more expensive. And solar power, they felt, was a bit unstable in terms of its supply to the grid. So there were all of these discussions, and Malawi is considering a coal-fired power plant rather than much more renewable energy alternatives, as is our countries like Zimbabwe, which is also being, a project is being financed by the Chinese. So you have all of these discussions. Let's move on to Asia, India and China. Just having a look at the time so that I don't go over time. So India and China is also, a very interesting comparison, because if you look at democracy and development, these are the two countries that may appear on paper to be polar opposites, because you have India, the world's largest democracy, China, which is not a democracy. But if you look at the development indicators per se, any major development indicator, be it infant mortality, health, education, electricity, infrastructure, China has for long been much, much better than India. If you look at these indicators, China has invested more in human development in most areas. But India, and this is where my mentor, my guru, Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, comes in. He's pointed out something that I've done considerable work on. He's pointed out the role of democratic politics in India has done something wonderful for India that China was not able to prevent, and that is a famine. So India has had a lot of famines before it became independent in 1947, as late as 1942, the Great Bengal Famine, where millions died. But ever since India became a democracy, an independent country in 1947, despite food insecurity, despite food crises, India has not had a famine. And Amartya Sen and others, including me, have made the argument it is because of democratic politics. It is about the free media. It is democratically elected politicians and their political parties, the discussions in parliament. In India, you will never have a visible crisis. Visibility is crucial here to keep in mind. You never have a big crisis, a major crisis like a famine. You could have a lot of other problems, but major crises that are visible, where people die in large numbers, has not taken place in India. Unlike in China, which between 59 and 61, 62, during the so-called Great Leap Forward, China experienced a major famine where an estimated 30 to 35 million people died. So here you see the democracy development kind of distinction. But coming closer back to the current situation, now both the leaders of India and China, President Xi of China, Prime Minister Modi of India, they came to the UN General Assembly in 2015 in September, signed the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, went back home, and both of them have surprisingly been very active in trying to operationalize sustainable development according to the local context. So in India, there have been state-run think tanks that are actually, they have developed local indicators, not just the global indicators, to operationalize this in practice. They're actually ranking states. India is a federal country. They're ranking states according to their achievements on this kind of SDG index. So they're not saying you're backward or forward. They're using, terms like aspiring states or front runners and things like that. But it is a bit of a naming and shaming that some are not doing as much, making as much progress as others. So you've seen this kind of operationalization also in China, publishing regular reports, even admitting that there are some areas that they could do a better job of. And one area, as you may have known of late, there's been a lot of attention, is how China has eradicated extreme poverty, which was mainly in rural areas. And a few weeks ago, they published this white paper saying, these are some of the lessons we've learned and other countries can learn from it. But the point here is that both India and China have actually had a similar focus in some areas, say in pollution control. Both of these countries have some of the most polluted cities in the world. But where the distinction is, or can be made, and where they differ is the same kind of strategies. Let me give you an example, odd and even strategy, where you allow in some of the most polluted cities, cars with an odd registration number, that is the number ending, the last digit, being odd or even on certain days. Not all cars can ply on every day. This, of course, has been accepted in China for a long time. When it was implemented in New Delhi, one of the most polluted cities in the world, that led to a lot of demonstrations. And still there's been this kind of disagreement? Does it really have an impact? And there you see kind of democratic politics coming in, whereas it was uncritically adopted in China. But in terms of certain things like pollution, like the use of pesticides, etc., the literature seems to say that democracies are better or able to, perhaps even non-democracies, to mobilize that kind of action when you see the harm in front of you, rather than, and this is something I want you to keep in mind, climate change, etc., which is seen to be much more long-term and slightly invisible, that these are creeping, slow onset of effects that we can't really see right away. And so that maybe is something that we could, again, keep in mind when we discuss. How about closer home to Norway? Here, of course, I was just reading about a fascinating case about the railway project in northern Norway, Nord-Norge-banen, where there's a lot of talk about how good this would be for the environment. By reducing the kind of road traffic, we'd have a lot of transportation of goods and people using the train. But it turns out that there's a lot of disagreement whether this infrastructure project is a good thing. So there's a lot of disagreement on the benefits, on whether actually it's possible to construct straight lines, which are important for the speed of the railway. And the straight kind of lines or the routes would require something that we are pretty good at in Norway, building tunnels. But the emissions from these major construction projects, some say, and these are news reports that have come out in the last few days or so, these emissions would perhaps, the disadvantages would far outweigh the benefits. So in something that looked good, perhaps isn't such a good idea. But we live in a democracy, so we're having this discussion, and political parties that were supporting it are now perhaps rethinking their policies. Take the case of the electric car subsidy, something that Norway is extremely proud of. In the last few years, I've lived in two cities, Oslo and Palo Alto, that have some of the highest concentrations of electric vehicles. And I'm very proud to say my wife and I finally ditched the diesel car and we've bought an electric car, and we really can't think about a situation, how could we ever have driven a non-electric car, because it's just so wonderful. But while the incentives that the Norwegian government gives in terms of making it affordable for us to buy an electric car are celebrated all over the world, there are also many who point to the fact, and there have been increasing criticisms, that we could be world champions in EVs and yet have a highly polluting oil industry that gives us all the money for our impressive welfare state. So there are inconsistencies there. And as you know, even in our country, in our city of Oslo, there's a polarized debate onto whether, and Lan Marie, one of the councillors of the Oslo municipal government, is a student of mine, and we've had lots of discussions on this, the extent to which elderly people who wish to drive and shop in the Oslo city center should be allowed to do so, because we are making it much more difficult to drive in, because we would like to set an example for the rest of the world to follow. But these, even when we know the solutions, there are disagreements. Even when we know what is to be done, there are contestations. We have political parties in this country saying we can't ditch diesel. All of these ambitious targets are great. Maybe it's good for an urban population. It wouldn't work in the districts. Another contentious example is wind power, which may be the solution for many, but a lot of people say aesthetics are bad, noise is bad, killing birds is bad. So even when we think we have a great example, it may not always work out. So those are some general examples. Let's move on to the final part of my talk, which is inspired by Tina Turner's song, "What's Love Got to Do with It?" So let me say, what's democracy got to do with all of this? Democracy is valuable for many reasons. Despite the fact I mentioned earlier that democracy is receding, there's backsliding, there's a regression, democracy has many, many virtues. Going back to my mentor, Amartya Sen, he often makes the distinction between an intrinsic value and an instrumental value. Intrinsic as in there's certain freedoms that we cherish. We love the smell of democracy. We like to be free, irrespective of what democracy brings or gives to us. So there's an intrinsic value in freedom, different types of freedom. But Amartya Sen and many others also talk about the instrumental value, that democracy, the ability to decide on who is going to represent us, the ability to organize ourselves, the ability to speak and express our views, gives us the ability to actually channelize our economic needs, articulate the force of economic needs so that the rulers know what we really want. They can't assume that we need something. We actually need to tell them that. And it is that instrumental value that democratic political freedoms provide us that is crucial. Others would say, and scholars like Adam Przowski, very famous, well-known democracy scholars, would say, what is particularly interesting for democracy is its ability to resolve conflicts, but resolve conflicts in such a way that you have democratic institutions that absorb disagreements, absorb these conflicts, and channelize it through institutions that have rules and regulations and some sort of predictability. And that leads to a result that is acceptable. Now, it turns out, Adam Przowski and others would say that these ways of resolving democratic disagreements, whether it is a railway project or a power project or electric car subsidies, it is often easier when the stakes are not too high or they're not too low, somewhere in between. And whoever loses a decision that has been made by an institution, it could be the courts or whichever public agency, whoever loses feels that they could somehow win the next time there's a chance, either through a new election or a change of circumstances. So there's always that possibility that you could win back. And so in many ways, you have all of these things that are going on with democracy, all the virtues, and yet the criticism has been that democracies are too short-sighted, that politicians are obsessed with being re-elected, rather than looking for maybe controversial but important long-term goals that will not give them the votes. They choose much more appealing, rhetorically appealing, populist policies that are just short-term intended. And this is something that democracy, anybody studying democracy development has been struggling with, that democracies often have the short-term 5-year, 4-year cycle perspective, because one can't take these. Sometimes politicians are scared to take unpopular decisions. I was recently listening to a perspective by our former Minister of the Environment and Climate, Ola Elvestuen, and he was saying actually politicians are able to balance the short term with the long run. And the electric car policy that we have in Norway is perhaps one example of that. But anyway, so there's a lot of debate out there on how capable democracy is. And in the final few minutes that I have, let me highlight a few issues that maybe we can discuss further, where I feel like there really is the need for democracies to maybe have further sort of attention on. One has to do with, of course, who in a democratic society is arguing for change. It's the agents of change kind of discussion. I'm glad that we have Siri here. You have a lot of focus in recent years on climate activists like Greta Thunberg and how they've really shifted the discussion, how using a combination of threats and naming and shaming and strikes, they have really made an impact. The kind of finger pointing has, some would say, in some situations, had some effect. The question is, who else is doing this? Is it NGOs? Is it the regular people? Or are we just outsourcing everything to our elected representatives? So that's the first set of issues. A second set, where I find there's a lot of tension in democratic politics on sustainable development, has to do with this generational kind of what is fair for which generation. So on the one hand, you have taxpayers in Norway, pensioners, etc., baby boomers saying, we had a very difficult lifestyle. Who are you to tell us now we should cut down our consumption because now we can afford to travel or whatever. And now you're telling us we can't do this, eat meat or travel, go to warmer climates, we also need to be looked. We can't just think about future generations. And see, maybe that's something you and I can discuss later on. In India, I heard a very interesting example also of people saying, you guys are talking about fifth floor issues about sustainable development, climate change. We are still stuck in the first floor. We have problems that we have to resolve now in terms of who gets what. We have limited resources. We can't think about future generations of generation that is yet to be born. We have so many problems. You guys in the rich parts of the world can think about future generations. We're still struggling with a lot of things that we're facing now. So the intergenerational kind of conflicts and who gets what, that is at the heart of the sustainable development definition, is up for grabs. A third set of issues has to do with institutions. We sometimes tend to place a lot of trust in the courts to resolve conflicts. And I've done several studies where the courts have actually, based on popular citizen protests and movements, made very progressive decisions. There have been legislations because of court judgments. But somehow politicians have also figured out a way in which some of these decisions by the judiciary are bypassed. They are selectively enforced. And a lot of climate activists in Norway have been disappointed by the role of the courts in terms of oil exploration, just an example. And similar cases have been tried in many parts of the world, including in India. So the role of institutions and how, and this is related to the agents of change. We can't just allow or think about the courts as being the saviors. We also have to have other institutions chipping in. And finally, in conclusion, let me highlight the fact that communication, I think, is a major challenge in democracies, in our countries like Norway or in India or in Malawi, in Kenya. There's been this tendency sometimes or in recent years to talk about this doom and gloom scenario, catastrophes. But it turns out now, and this is something that some of you may disagree with me, but this doom and gloom narrative can also sometimes be a turnoff, that the galvanizing power of catastrophes is receding. As I mentioned earlier, pesticides or water pollution, air pollution is something that we can relate to. But when it is a slowly creeping onset of climate change that is not as visible, we may not be so willing to talk about this gloom and doom scenario. So how we communicate, how we sort of finger point, whether we name and shame and force people to change their behaviors, all of these things are going to be important. How do we actually use persuasion rather than force or coercion? That is the most important thing for me, is to persuade me. When my kids who go to school here in Oslo and who learn about sustainable development come home and say, Daddy, Mommy, don't buy this product because it's got palm oil, that has much more of an impact on me than I suppose if I just read about it. So how we communicate, how we disseminate information is going to be pretty challenging. So let me leave it at that. And thank you again for this opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you so much, Dan, for a really, really interesting and thought-provoking talk, and also shows the really like breadth or the width of the problem, but also the width of potential impact. I think if I can start and then Siri can jump in next. I think like on my end, I would start to first saying that your talk really shows just how the scale of the problem, but also the scale of what's at stake, right? You go from climate to health to politics to the courts. So I think this connection between democracy and sustainability obviously has a really, really huge field of impact. But at the same time, and as you talked and touched upon in the beginning of your talk, is this danger, as I see it, of course, and as you note, that suddenly sustainability becomes everything and nothing because the width of the field is so big, right? And it can be used in so many different contexts. So let me start off with a question that will narrow it down a bit, but it still touches upon some of the things that you talked about. And it's obvious to me that in this setting, since we're sitting here on a Zoom call, I have to connect it to the ongoing COVID pandemic. And I would like to ask you a question, or if you could reflect a bit on COVID-19, I've written down here in my notes, like COVID-19 as a crisis of democracy and non-sustainability. And what I would like for you to think about or talk a bit about is, do you think that this turn towards autocracies, as you mentioned, do you think that the COVID pandemic will make this worse? I mean, we've seen the rise of a lot of legal things that have been hammered through in the name of stopping the infections. We've seen the penetration of different contact tracing apps here in Norway is one example, but across the globe, where in the name of infectious control measurements, democratic tendencies, if they haven't been breached, then at least they've been challenged in the name of stopping a crisis. Do you think that COVID might make the turn towards autocracy worse?
Oh, thank you. That was a great question, Tony. I think for a long time, and I know that some of my colleagues like Francis Fukuyama, Larry Diamond, they've been really interested in looking at the role of technology and democracy, you know, how apps, etc., our social media profile, how they give vital information, and that could compromise our privacy, our desire to be anonymous. And yes, the kind of technology that we are witnessing now that is used to track people, you know, in China, face recognition technology, but also the apps. We've had an unsuccessful app in this country that was not used. But yes, I think in many ways, we have to be a little aware that technology can be good. It can actually help you trace movement. It can help in terms of public health, in terms of preventing a rapid spread of infections, but it can also be used for other more nefarious purposes. And it is what we have signed up to. It is not just in autocracies, actually also in democracies, how private sector actors are maybe using or harvesting our track records, our browsing histories. All of this is perhaps undermining our ability to make decisions. And sometimes, you know, like when you've searched for a certain thing, and then the next few weeks you're inundated with adverts on that. So I think COVID is a very unique. It may be some sort of a critical juncture that we've reached, where we see technology having good effects, but we have to be aware of how it can be abused. But in terms of the overarching question, Tony, I think COVID has also exposed some of the weaknesses of technology. For example, not everybody can be like you and me, work from home. Not everybody has access to high-speed internet. Not everybody has space. Just the very fact that even in this country, one of the richest in the world, if you are in a small apartment and you have kids who are also going to be homeschooled, it is just difficult. So space and all of this has exposed, you know, the kind of inequalities that are present in rich countries, but also much more in low-income countries. So, for example, people who work in the informal sector, how are you going to use technology and get them to avoid from going to the markets? Because they have to go to the markets because their livelihoods depend on them working every day. So I think we have to really think about these broader issues of the informality, the informal sector, and also maybe this is the crux of the argument. We really can't apply a universal blueprint, Tony, in all contexts. What works here, what works and what we feel safe with in terms of technology or any surveillance in Norway may not be what, you know, how it would work in another context. I'm not sure if I got to the gist of your question, but we can continue.
I think you really did. I guess, Siri, if you have a question or comment.
Yes, first I want to thank you for your very interesting points, and I can really feel the wheels turning in my head. So that's definitely a good thing. I also just want to say sustainability is definitely a concept that is kind of easy to grasp the idea, but hard to concretize it and bring it into action. And it's easy that it just becomes a buzzword. and a word for virtue signaling. And you can see that in politics now that we're coming closer to an election, that the word sustainability often comes up, and once you hear it, you think, yeah, that's great, but we need to actually discuss what is sustainability, what does it mean for us, what does it mean for others. Yeah, operationalization is definitely a key word, as you said. In bringing about these discussions, I was thinking a bit about different types of democracies or democratic processes. We've had very few direct democratic processes in Norway, but I was thinking a bit about the direct and indirect democratic processes. How do they affect how we think about sustainability and issues? Could this help bring about some discussions, maybe?
Yeah, thanks, Siri. You're absolutely right. I think that is a great point. You know, we have to really think about how we can address these disagreements, because, you know, I keep telling my students that whenever we do a literature review, whenever we try to get an overview, we really can't just focus on agreement, even though in Norway we like consensus. We have to also think about those who disagree with us and how we can channelize those disagreements in a meaningful debate. And a lot of people would say that you and me and Tony and others in the center, she at the universities, at think tanks, we all actually have a very important role in disseminating knowledge. So it is about, you know, being a researcher means being critical, balanced, independent. We can't just be one-sided. But how we disseminate the empirical evidence, the scientific evidence, is absolutely crucial. That's why we do these webinars. That's why we have public lectures. That's why we have podcasts and YouTube videos or write op-ed pieces. These are extremely crucial, so that they're not just the knowledge that we produce are not just limited to our select academic journals or books, but are widely accessible. But we also have to bridge the gap between research and policy. We have to actually reach out to politicians, pick up the phone. And I think one of the ways in which I feel I have had some influence is interacting with ministers that we have in Norway, launching programs or official strategies, interacting with them, you know, having a podcast discussion, whatever. These are avenues in terms of trying to influence policy. But Siri, in terms of your specific question, there's also a lot of talk about deliberative democracy that we really should discuss more, that we maybe one way of addressing political polarization, and especially in countries like the United States, but also in Europe, is through what my Stanford colleague James Fishkin calls deliberative polling, that you get people together, you get people from all different political worlds, people with different beliefs, Republicans, Democrats, you know, people anti-immigration, for taxes, against taxes together, and expose them to the evidence that there is, get them to discuss, expose them to the knowledge that is. Don't discriminate in terms of the discussion. There should be a diversity of knowledge, but there should also be this moderated discussion based on a balanced perspective, weighing the evidence. And that is the kind of principle behind deliberative polling, based on deliberative democracy. And it turns out you have polar opposites people, people from very different political spectrums coming together, spending a week or two discussing things, weighing evidence, just like like in a jury, in a court trial, and then reaching very sort of similar situations, some sort of a middle perspective. I'm just thinking maybe that's one way to go, something that we could try out to address political polarization and disagreements.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, Siri, go ahead, Siri.
Yeah, I can definitely also see that being translated into our education, for sure. So hopefully in the future we will see more. Of course, in my degree in nutrition, we discuss a lot of nutrition cases, but I think we can bring sustainability in there as well, and just opening up these arenas for discussion would be, yeah.
So Tony, can I just very quickly, I just thought of one area I know. Well, firstly, I'm just trying to sell the idea of why university education is important. It is precisely, Siri, what you said. It is that exposing each other to different types of criticisms, right? And we want to train our students to think critically, but in a balanced way. we can't really be subject to these echo chambers that digital technology somehow guides us into, whether it's a Facebook group with like-minded people that we want to chat with, and not read perhaps an op-ed piece, which is critical. I think that is important. But think about, you know, things like you work on, Siri, in terms of diets. Remember a couple of years ago when the Eat Foundation launched its report asking Norwegians to cut down on red meat, there was this uproar. It has to do with cultural, you know, feelings. You know, we do this, we've always done it. Why should we change our behaviors? It's a Norwegian lifestyle. It could be in relation to any other kind of activity that we, you know, either, you know, exercising or eating more healthy lifestyle, eating more healthy for healthy lifestyles. All of these things are controversial. Still another example, Tony and Siri, would be degrowth. A lot of people are now challenging, and I forgot to mention this, in terms of democracy's ability, or this fixation we have on economic growth. A lot of activists and also some scholars are saying that we should be reducing our growth targets, talking about degrowth. But this is a very polarized discourse. Most mainstream economists debunk this. They say that degrowth is not the way to go about it. So all of these issues have to be debated, Siri, in the classrooms, in the public realm, and hopefully we'll be better off once we've seen the facts and weigh them against each other.
Thank you, Dan, for your reflection on that. I see that you know, time flies when we're having an interesting conversation, and we have like 10 minutes, and there's 4 really interesting questions that's popped up in the Q&A section. So I'll actually defer my next set of questions to the Q&A, and I wonder, do you want me to read them for you, Dan, and then you can reply to them, or?
Yes, please, all of them at once, and then if you give me a few minutes to react.
Yeah, sure. These are really, really interesting, but also quite long, some of them. But I'll start with the first one, and we'll just like work where I'll read the 4 of them. So the first one is from Satya Dash, who says, what is electoral autocracy and its significance to India? Democracy and poverty eradication. China has eradicated poverty, but India is still struggling since independence. How is democracy connected with this primary issue? And then a follow-up question, which is from the same viewer, is how will you correlate democracy with COVID-19? So those are 2 intertwined questions. And then the third question from Björn Brautset says, you mentioned the connection between democracy and the ability to mitigate famine. How would you respond to the situation in India in comparison to China, where a counter argument would be made that authoritarianism can deal with a pandemic better than states bogged down by deliberation in democracies? And then the final question is Saika Safar, who says, to attain the SDGs, is there a roadmap for different countries classified as developed, developing, and underdeveloped countries? Since climate crisis is knocking on our door, instead of persuasion, do we need immediate actions? And if global communities like the Paris Agreement enforce regulation, is it compromising the democracy of a particular country? How do we balance between democratic action and urgent action? And I think all of these questions are really, really fascinating and interesting. So, yeah.
I agree. So thanks. Those were 4 really, really good questions. And so, Tony, I have like a few minutes, maybe 4, 5?
You have 7 minutes, actually.
Oh, 7. Oh, that's a luxury. So let me address Satya's question. There is, as you know, Satya, I think there's been a pushback from the Indian government against this classification of India as an electoral autocracy. The discussion has always, or of late, been that it is the kind of feeling among activists, among scholars, that there's been a shrinking space for democratic expressions, that there's been this hounding of anybody disagreeing with the current regime that has led to this classification of India being less democratic than perhaps a lot of Indians believe it to be. So in relation to poverty reduction, of course, and this is a long debate, China has claimed that it has reduced rural poverty, it has eradicated rural poverty, but it turns out, and I was recently in a discussion with some of the key architects that have been thinking about on planning these programs in China, they agree that rural poverty has been reduced, but there are lots of challenges that remain. And as you're aware, both India and China are faced with growing income inequality. So while China has attained at least this basic level of poverty, extreme poverty eradication, India still has that problem. So, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of literature on democracy and development. And it turns out that the Chinese example is really, in many ways, interesting. It builds on this feeling that non-democracies have typically had the highest economic growth rates, and this has to do with East Asian countries, and we're talking about South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, historically. But non-democracies have also had the worst economic growth rates. Democracies have always been somewhat in the middle, pursuing this Buddhist middle path. And that is where the China model is increasingly becoming more popular. A lot of countries feel that maybe China's learning from the Chinese example is a better way of doing it rather than messing with the democratic realities. Others would say that the China example, yeah, is great, but it is really an exception. What you really have is a much more sustainable, much more predictable forms of poverty reduction if you follow democratic principles. So I'm going to just leave it at that since we don't have that much time, but we can, I'm sure, discuss. I know you follow me on Twitter, so I'm sure we can discuss this on Twitter. Democracy and COVID-19. I don't think I'm the best person to say anything. I'm sure lots of others have said, quite a lot. I think I was mentioning earlier about the role of people who work in the informal sector. I think, at least in terms of, sometimes in democratic societies, we tend to give a lot of attention to elites, to academics, to those who shout the loudest, because if you don't shout, you don't get a piece of the pie. And those who don't shout that much, those whose voices are often not heard, are people who are really, really struggling to make a living. And they often are the traders, the hawkers, the street sellers, people who have to go out of their houses, who can't really be safe in the confines of their house. They don't have a fridge at home. They need to buy food every day to be able to feed their families. And it is those perspectives I was mentioning earlier. This lack of appreciation of those voices has often characterized democratic politics. I hope that COVID is going to change that those voices are going to be heard, that those inequalities have been laid much more bare, and now people are much more aware that there are all of these other groups. India is a great example. So the government enforced a strict lockdown with 4 hours notice. And it turns out that those who were most affected were migrants who had to leave the big cities, and just the journey back home was treacherous for them. So I think public policy will be better in the future. That's at least my hope, because we've learned from the pandemic. Björn, the famine story, I'm not sure if I remember exactly the question, but let me just maybe sum up. I think the argument that I've made, and I know I've tried to, and it sounds a bit ambitious, to refine a Nobel Prize winner's argument, Amartya Sen's. I've tried to refine it by saying that, well, Amartya Sen says democracies prevent famines, right? But he also has said that democracies are not often able to prevent regular hunger, starvation deaths. So you have India, which is really a fascinating story where, yes, the big famines have been avoided, but India is also one of the hungriest nations on earth. So if you look at undernutrition, it is South Asia that is the problematic region. It's not sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a lot there that can be done. And that is something I've tried to address in my work when I'm trying to refine Sen, is trying to address why is it that democracies are very good at addressing major visible crises like a famine. Democracies are good when devastation is very visible, when there's a flood, there's a drought, a flood or a cyclone. But when it's a slow onset drought, and it's in the far-flung areas where some people who are not very vociferous in their demands are dying, democracy is perfectly willing to ignore those people. So I think the challenge for democracies is to move beyond the kind of crisis-induced response to much more looking at regular problems of deprivation. And finally, on the SDGs, the roadmap, that's also a great question. There are some really good, all four were really good questions. The SDG roadmap, you know, I think a lot of discussion nowadays, at least from a developing or low-income country perspective, when I go to Malawi or Kenya or any other country, there's this feeling among policymakers that it is just too overwhelming. There are all of these international agendas. There is Paris on climate, there is Paris on aid, there is the SDGs, and there are just this overwhelmed. There's just too many obligations, and they don't have enough financing. So that's one thing. So, you know, from a low-income country perspective, from their bureaucrats, from their leaders, the feeling is, oh, we just barely finished with the Millennium Development Goals. Now you want us to talk about the SDGs. We don't have money. We don't have the capacity. And it's just too much. Tell us where to start. And so there are all kinds of projects going on in terms of addressing maybe some of these trade-offs. Is it something that we could prioritize first? Whereas often the tendency in the sustainable development discourse is that you can't prioritize, you must have a bit of everything. So there's a lot of now growing academic interest in trying to identify what should poor countries do? Where are the funding mechanisms coming from? What should be the role of the private sector? Should one start with typical developmental issues like health, education, poverty, hunger, and then come to higher level needs, as some would say, in terms of climate change, environment? Or should we go the other way around? Can we have more at the same time or less of something else? So these are some of the debates that are going on. And at the moment, unfortunately, there isn't that magic bullet prescription that this country should do this or that other country should do that. I think every country, every region should be having these local discussions and figuring out what to do, how they can adapt global goals to local realities. Countries like India and China are doing it. I think much more of this is needed in other low-income country contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for answering the great questions. We did have one last question, but I think we were all out of time, unfortunately. I would like to, first of all, say thank you once again to Dan and Siri for joining me today here and for both providing excellent questions and reflections through Siri. And then thank you, Dan, for your talk. It was really inspiring to hear. And then I would definitely say thank you to everyone who joined us today, and keep an eye out for more She Talks. We will have one, I think it's on the 26th of May, which then will connect sustainability to loneliness, which is a theme that is emerging in scholarship, but also I think a theme that COVID has really put a highlight on. So please join us for that. And once again, thank you everyone, and goodbye.